Humiliated publicly for not having money to eat, he still gave his last dollars to a desperate mother. This unexpected act triggered something unimaginable, capable of changing the fate of an entire city. The central square of Millfield buzzed with life on that Saturday afternoon. Children ran between the peeling wooden benches, playing hide and seek, while adults gathered in warm conversations, divided between the town's business and the week's gossip. The snow began to melt under the first signs of spring, leaving muddy puddles between the uneven stones of the pavement. Caleb Peterson, with his worn boots and tattered jacket, walked with his gaze lowered, trying not to attract attention. The small restaurant, Millfield's Finest, was one of the few establishments still operating decently in the town. His eyes landed on the menu fixed next to the door: potato soup with homemade bread. It was cheap, but not for someone counting coins. He hesitated, holding a handful of change in his pocket. Upon entering the restaurant, he felt the stares turn towards him. The place was packed. Well-dressed people filled the tables while Caleb made his way to the counter. Behind the register stood Mr. Winston, the restaurant owner, and a series of small businesses in town. A robust man with neatly combed grey hair, he emanated authority and disdain. Caleb cleared his throat before speaking. "A soup, please." Winston sized him up with narrowed eyes before glancing at the handful of coins Caleb placed on the counter. With a cold smile, he pushed the coins back. "Looks like you're a bit short, Peterson. Got more, or should I add it to your imaginary ledger?" The dining room fell silent. Conversation stopped, and all eyes turned to Caleb. He flushed instantly, wishing the ground would swallow him whole. Trying to maintain his composure, he rummaged through his pockets, but found only lint and dust. "Maybe he began to say, but was interrupted. "Listen up, everyone," Winston announced, amplifying his voice for all to hear. "Here's an example of how things are going wrong in this town. You want a meal, Caleb? Work harder, or better yet, learn to live within your means." A solitary laugh echoed from the corner, followed by a few more. Caleb kept his eyes fixed on the counter, his fists clenched at his sides. He knew that retorting would only make things worse. Finally, he turned, walking out under a wave of whispers and muffled laughter. Outside, the fresh air did not offer the relief he had hoped for. Caleb sat down on a bench beside the square, feeling the crushing weight of humiliation. Across the street, Amelia Blake, a young mother pushing a rusty stroller, had witnessed everything. She hesitated. She knew Winston well enough to realize that confronting him would be a mistake. At the same time, something within her stirred, an indignation she could not ignore. As she walked past the square, she tried to make eye contact with Caleb, but he was absorbed, staring at his empty hands. Inside the restaurant, Winston watched the scene through the window. His eyes betrayed something he rarely showed: dissatisfaction. He knew that Millfield was in decline. His businesses, which once thrived, were now struggling to stay afloat. He firmly believed that the town needed discipline, not compassion, to rise again, and Caleb was to him the symbol of everything that was wrong: weakness, dependency, failure. "Let's get back to work, folks," Winston ordered his staff, but his expression remained grim. Later, Caleb trudged back to his small trailer parked on the outskirts of town. The place was as worn down as he was, with windows covered in plastic instead of glass, and a heater that worked only on a whim. He flopped onto the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling as flashes of the day played in his mind like a poorly edited film. Humiliation was familiar, but it never failed to hurt. Since his mother's death, Caleb had carried a burden that seemed to grow heavier each year, working temporary jobs, facing judgmental gazes, and above all, surviving. He closed his eyes, trying to erase the memory of the laughter in the square. Suddenly, a soft sound pulled him back to the present, a knock on the door. Reluctantly, Caleb got up and opened it, finding Amelia standing there holding a small paper bag. I brought something for you," she said somewhat awkwardly. "I couldn't help but see what happened today." Caleb looked at the bag and then at Amelia. "So I'm fine, you didn't have to." You're not, Caleb. And it's okay not to be, she interrupted, her tone firm, surprising him. Just accept it, please. He took the bag hesitantly. Inside was a simple sandwich and an apple. The simplicity of the gesture touched him more than he expected. Thank you, he murmured, unsure how to express his gratitude. Amelia smiled briefly, but before she could say anything more, a small voice called from the stroller. Mommy, let's go home. I need to go, she said, turning away. But Caleb, don't let Winston define you. He knows nothing about you. Amelia's words echoed in Caleb's mind as he returned inside. For the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of warmth amidst the coldness of his routine. The next day, the square was even busier. Rumors about the incident at the restaurant had spread, and the townspeople were divided in their opinions. Some blamed Caleb, saying he needed to try harder, while others began questioning Winston and his unyielding stance. In the back of the square, an elderly man quietly observed everything. Jacob Morris, a recluse rarely seen in public, watched Caleb with interest. What he saw in that young man was something others did not: a quiet resilience. To Jacob, Caleb was the antithesis of Winston, not a failure, but someone who, despite everything, still held on to his dignity. Jacob turned and began walking back to his home, pondering what he could do to change the fate of that town and perhaps Caleb's as well. As Caleb tried to resume his routine, what he didn't know was that his life was about to change. Between the paper bag delivered by Amelia, the silent glances from Jacob, and Winston's growing obsession to bring him down, something greater was being woven behind the scenes of Millfield. What did Jacob truly want by observing Caleb? And why did Winston seem so intent on crushing him? The weight of humiliation was just the beginning. The sky over Millfield was grey, heavy with the promise of more rain. Caleb Peterson walked through the streets of the town with slow steps, his hands stuffed in the pockets of his worn jacket. The humiliation from the restaurant still weighed on his mind, but he tried to push the thoughts away. He had more urgent concerns, like finding something to eat with the few dollars that remained in his pocket. He turned the corner and stopped in front of Tyler's grocery store, a small market that supplied the basic necessities for the town's residents. A sign in the window advertised a sale on bread and eggs, but Caleb knew that even that might be out of reach. With a sigh, he stepped inside. Inside, the atmosphere was bustling. A woman with a small girl holding her hand stood in line at the register. Caleb immediately recognized Amelia Blake, the young mother who had tried to speak to him after the incident in the square. He noticed her gaze fixed on the cashier, her hands nervously rummaging through her bag. I just need a few more days to pay, Amelia said to Mr. Tyler, the store owner, who had his arms crossed behind the counter. Amelia, I've already let you take things on credit before. I can't keep doing this, he replied, his voice filled with a mixture of frustration and fatigue. The girl beside Amelia, with brown curls escaping from a wool hat, tugged at her mother's sleeve. Mommy, I'm hungry. Amelia knelt down to stroke her daughter's face, a gesture that immediately brought a memory of his own mother to Caleb's mind. He could see his mother years ago, making the same gesture when she tried to comfort him, even when there wasn't enough food at home. He couldn't just stand there. His sweaty hands tightened around the coins in his pocket as he took a step forward. How much does she owe? Amelia turned, surprised, while Tyler narrowed his eyes at Caleb. And what are you going to do, Peterson? Pay for her, Tyler said with a dry laugh. Yes, I will pay, Caleb replied, with a firmness that surprised him. He pulled the handful of coins from his pocket and placed them on the counter. Here, this should cover what she needs. Amelia tried to protest. No, Caleb, you don't have to. Yes, I do. It's the right thing to do, he said, not looking directly at her. Tyler looked at the coins with a resigned sigh before pushing the bag of groceries toward Amelia. So it's paid for. Amelia took the bag, her eyes welling up as she looked at Caleb. I don't know how to thank you. You don't need to thank me, just take care of her, Caleb said, nodding toward the girl before quickly leaving the store, not waiting for more conversation. Outside, the cold wind cut across Caleb's face as he walked away from the grocery store. He felt a mix of relief and anxiety. The feeling of having done something right, something good, was comforting, but the emptiness in his pocket reminded him that he now faced another day without knowing where his next meal would come from. When he reached his trailer, he threw himself onto the narrow bed and rested his head on the thin pillow. The silence of the place was deafening, broken only by the occasional sound of wind against the plastic-covered windows. He closed his eyes, and memories of his mother flooded back. It was as if he could hear her again. "Caleb, kindness is the only currency that never loses value," she used to say every time they had to share the last slice of bread or help a neighbor in need, even when they could barely help themselves. He remembered one night years ago when his mother had given her dinner to an elderly neighbor who was sick. Caleb, a hungry child at the time, didn't understand why his mother would do something so irrational. Now, he understood. Those small gestures were what gave meaning to her life, and now they were what gave meaning to his. Meanwhile, across town, Amelia was tucking Emily into bed, wrapping her in a worn blanket. The girl's face was relaxed, finally fed and safe, but Amelia couldn't shake off what Caleb had done for them. She sat at the kitchen table staring at the grocery bag. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get them through a few days. Caleb's gesture touched her deeply. He was a stranger, someone who barely had enough for himself, yet he chose to help her. Amelia felt ashamed for having judged Caleb in the past as someone who was just surviving without ambitions. Now she saw a depth in him that she never expected to find. "Who are you, Caleb Peterson?" she whispered to herself. The next morning, Caleb woke to the sound of footsteps outside the trailer. He quickly got up, zipping his old jacket, which barely held off the cold. When he opened the door, there stood Amelia, holding something folded in her arms. "I thought you might need this," she said, extending a thick, well-kept jacket. It was visibly used, but far better than anything Caleb had at the moment. Caleb looked at the jacket and then at Amelia, confused. "I can't accept this. You have enough to worry about." "Caleb, please. I saved this jacket for my brother, but he moved south and won't need it anymore. And I know you need it. Consider this. A thank you for what you did for me and Emily," she said with a gentle smile. He hesitated, but feeling the biting wind against his hands, he relented. He took the jacket and put it on, feeling the immediate warmth envelop him. It's really nice, thank you, Amelia, really." She shrugged, but her eyes carried something deeper. "Sirs, you don't need to thank me. You've already done more for me than you realize." Before he could respond, Emily came running up beside her mother, smiling. "Mommy, what did he think?" the girl asked with evident curiosity. "He thinks it's perfect, dear," Amelia replied, looking at Caleb with a gaze that seemed to say, "You are not alone." And for the first time in a long time, Caleb felt something more than the weight of survival. He felt the warmth of a genuine connection. As Caleb closed the door, holding the jacket carefully, he had no idea that this small act of kindness had planted seeds in unexpected places. Amelia began to see him differently, and his gesture would attract more attention than he could foresee. But what Caleb didn't know was that someone was watching everything silently. Jacob Morris, the recluse of the town, was about to make a move that would change Caleb's life forever. Before we dive into the next chapter, if you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and share your thoughts in the comments below. It helps our channel grow and ensures we can keep bringing you more heartfelt stories like this one. Now let's continue the journey. The rumors in Millfield spread as quickly as the cold wind blowing through the streets. The day after the incident at the grocery store, the story of Caleb Peterson paying for Amelia's groceries was already on everyone's lips. In the bakery, two men debated whether the gesture was admirable or naive. In John's barbershop, a group of townsfolk speculated whether Caleb was trying to gain sympathy, or if he simply didn't know how to manage his own money. In Tyler's small market, the owner himself commented to his wife, He barely has enough for himself, but he wants to play the hero. This is going to end badly. But not everyone saw it that way. Some women from the local church mentioned Caleb in their prayers, admiring his generosity, while others began to question Mr. Winston's cold demeanor, especially after the incident at the restaurant. In the mechanic shop where Caleb worked, the atmosphere was tense. He arrived early as usual, but felt the stares of his co-workers. It was as if his decision to help Amelia had shifted something invisible among them. He tried to ignore them, focusing on fixing the engine of an old truck. Shortly after noon, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the shop. Caleb looked up to see Mr. Winston standing in the doorway with a serious, calculating expression. He was dressed in a suit as always, but there was something about the way he gripped his cane, tighter than usual. "Peterson, can I speak with you?" Winston said, his voice sharp as a blade. Caleb wiped his hands on a dirty rag, hesitating. "Sure." The other mechanics discreetly moved away, leaving Caleb and Winston alone. The businessman crossed his arms, looking Caleb up and down. "So you think you're a hero now? Saving damsels in distress with coins you shouldn't even be spending?" Winston said, his voice dripping with disdain. Caleb remained calm. "I only did what I thought was right. I wasn't trying to be anything." "Don't come to me with that humility. I know exactly what you're doing. You're trying to win people's sympathy, making them forget who you really are. Someone who has never worked hard enough to rise out of poverty." Caleb felt the heat rise to his face, but forced himself to breathe deeply. "If that's what you think, I can't change your opinion. But I know what I did and why." Winston stepped closer, pointing his cane at him. "Then let me simplify your life, since you seem so pleased to be the martyr of this town. You're fired. Pack your things and get out of here." Caleb's world seemed to waver for a moment. He needed that job. It was all he had to support himself. But looking at Winston with his triumphant expression ignited something within him. A spark of dignity that couldn't be extinguished, even in the face of yet another loss. "If that's what you think is best," Caleb finally said, picking up his tools. He left the shop without looking back. That night, Caleb sat on the edge of his trailer, the cold wind biting at his face. He was still wearing the jacket that Amelia had given him. The warmth of the fabric was comforting, but his mind was heavy. He had lost his job. Again. And all for what? For doing what he thought was right. As he gazed into the dark horizon, he heard soft footsteps. He turned to see Amelia approaching, holding a small lantern and a bag. "Caleb," she said as she neared him, "I heard what happened at the shop. This was my fault, wasn't it?" He shook his head. "No, Amelia." Winston was already looking for an excuse. This just gave him a reason. She moved closer, sitting beside him on the trailer step. "Even so, it's not fair. You did something good, and now you're being punished for it." Caleb sighed, looking down. "It's not the first time something like this has happened. It seems like every time I try to do something right, I end up losing more than I gain." Amelia was silent for a moment, then opened the bag and took out a small container. "I know it's not much, but I wanted to give back somehow. I made soup, warm. I thought it might help." He looked at the container, surprised. "You've already given me so much, Amelia. You didn't have to do this." "I had to. Caleb, you helped me when no one else would. I can't change what happened with Winston, but at least I can make sure you don't go to bed hungry." He accepted the soup, feeling the warmth of the container in his hands. "Thank you, truly." Amelia smiled softly, but her gaze was serious. "Caleb, you're not alone. I know what it's like to feel like the world is against you, but you did something for me and Emily that I will never forget. You gave us hope, and that's worth more than anything." For a moment, the silence between them was stronger than any words. Caleb realized that, for the first time in a long while, he felt like someone truly understood him. Meanwhile, in another part of town, Mr. Winston was in his office, looking out the window at the dim lights of Millfield. He held a glass of whiskey, swirling the amber liquid without drinking. "What are you doing, Winston?" he murmured to himself. He thought of Caleb, the serene expression with which the young man had accepted his firing. There was something about Caleb that deeply unsettled him. He wasn't like the others. He didn't react with anger or despair. He simply moved forward, as if carrying an invisible weight that Winston would never understand. Winston narrowed his eyes, feeling a mix of contempt and envy. He pushed the thought aside. No, that was ridiculous. Caleb was a nobody, someone who should be content with his place in life, not challenging it with acts of kindness that only highlighted the failures of others. But deep down, Winston knew his anger wasn't just about Caleb. It was about Millfield. The town was dying, and he didn't know how to save it. And watching someone like Caleb, with so little, still trying to make a difference, was a constant reminder of his own impotence. He tipped the glass of whiskey back, downing it in one gulp. But the bitter taste left in his mouth wasn't from the alcohol. The next day, Amelia decided to do something she had been putting off for too long. She invited Caleb to dinner at her home. He hesitated, saying he didn't want to be a bother, but she insisted, and he finally agreed. Amelia's home was small but cozy. Emily ran to greet Caleb, beaming widely. "You came," the girl said, holding his hand. During dinner, Amelia began to open up about her life. She shared how Emily's father had left them when the girl was small and how she struggled to balance work, bills, and raising her daughter alone. "It's not easy, but she's everything to me," Amelia said, looking at Emily, who was playing with a toy nearby. Caleb listened intently, feeling a growing connection with her. He realized that despite his own struggles, there were others in Millfield facing battles just as difficult as his, and somehow that gave him strength. As the night came to an end, Amelia walked Caleb to the door. "Thank you for coming. And Caleb, I know things are tough right now, but you are stronger than you think." He smiled faintly. "Maybe, but sometimes it's hard to remember that." Amelia placed her hand on his arm in a brief gesture, yet full of meaning. "Then let me remind you." As Caleb made his way back to his trailer, something inside him had changed, but he still didn't know that in another part of town, Jacob Morris was watching. And the reclusive man had plans that would transform not only Caleb's life, but the entire Millfield. The question was, would Caleb be ready for what was to come? The following morning dawned cold, and the frost sparkled like tiny diamonds on Millfield's lawn. Caleb stood in front of the trailer, wearing Amelia's new jacket snugly fitted to his body. It was the first time in a long while that he felt a comforting warmth in his bones as he faced the day. He knew he needed to do something productive, but he had been aimless since Winston fired him. As his thoughts began to swirl into anguish, he heard footsteps. It was Amelia, with Emily running alongside her, carrying a toolbox that was bigger than her little hands could manage. "Caleb," Emily shouted as if she had known him for years. "You can fix things, right?" Caleb smiled, crouching down to grab the toolbox before she dropped it. "I think I can fix a few things." Amelia stepped closer, her expression shy yet determined. "The back door of the house is falling off. I thought maybe you could help us." He hesitated, but Emily's hopeful smile was enough to break his resistance. "Sure, let's go." Amelia's house was modest, with a wooden fence that had seen better days and a garden overrun with weeds. The place exuded effort, as if every corner was maintained with care and determination despite the hardships. Caleb immediately noticed the back door, hanging precariously from a rusty hinge. "It's worse than I imagined," he said, examining the structure. "It's been like that since we moved in, but I've never had the time or money to fix it," Amelia replied, crossing her arms as if apologizing for the state of things. Caleb set to work, adjusting the hinges while Emily watched every move with curious eyes. "You're like a hero, you know," she suddenly said, her mischievous smile brightening her face. He laughed, nearly choking on the comment. "No, Emily, I just know how to fix things." "That's what heroes do. They fix everything that's broken, she insisted, bouncing around excitedly. Amelia, standing in the kitchen doorway, overheard the conversation and chuckled softly. Emily has a vivid imagination. Caleb looked at the girl and then back at Amelia. Maybe she's right, but some repairs take longer than others. The phrase lingered in the air for a moment, heavy with a meaning that everyone seemed to feel but no one dared to comment on. As Caleb worked across town, Jacob Morris was at his secluded property, gazing at the horizon. Jacob's house reflected him, large, imposing, yet desolate. The windows were dusty, and the garden, once meticulously tended, was now covered in dry leaves and broken branches. He held a warm cup of tea, but his hands trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from pains that had become more frequent. Sitting in his favorite armchair, Jacob reread a letter he had started writing the night before for the third time. His words were careful, but he still didn't know how Caleb would react to the invitation. There was something about the young man that intrigued him deeply. Caleb carried the weight of the world on his shoulders, yet still moved with a resilience Jacob hadn't seen in years. Jacob cleared his throat and placed the letter in an envelope. He touched his chest, feeling the lingering pain that seemed never to fade. "I need to do this soon," he murmured to himself. Back at Amelia's house, Caleb had finished the repair. The door was now sturdy and Emily was testing it repeatedly, opening and closing it as if it were a new toy. "Perfect," she exclaimed, her smile so bright that it nearly erased the fatigue from Caleb's eyes. "I told you he was a hero," the girl added, looking at Amelia, who smiled and shook her head. "Thank you, Caleb. I don't know how I can repay everything you've done for us," Amelia said, holding out a cup of coffee she had brought for him. "You don't need to repay anything. I think helping you helps me too," he replied, almost as a confession. The comment made Amelia pause for a moment. She felt the weight of Caleb's words, as if he were finally admitting that in his kindness there was also a need to feel useful, to find purpose. Emily interrupted the moment, holding out a piece of paper she had torn from a notebook. "I made this for you," she said, handing the drawing to Caleb. The paper depicted a tall man with messy hair and a large jacket, holding a tool in his hand. Beside him was a small, smiling figure that looked like Emily. At the top of the page it was written in crooked letters, "My hero." Caleb looked at the drawing, unsure of what to say. He felt something warm inside him, something that had seemed frozen for a long time. "Thank you, Emily. I'll keep this always." Amelia watched the interaction, her eyes filling with a mixture of gratitude and hope. Later, as Caleb was heading back to his trailer, he noticed something strange in the small, rusted mailbox at the entrance of his lot. There was an envelope inside, marked with elegant handwriting. He opened the paper carefully, reading the meticulously written words. "Caleb, I have been observing how you have dealt with adversity in Millfield. Your strength and character remind me of something I thought had long disappeared in this town. I would like to invite you to talk. Something tells me you and I have more in common than you might imagine. Jacob Morris." Caleb frowned. He knew who Jacob was, or at least he thought he did. The man was a mystery in town, rarely seen outside his home. Some said he was eccentric, others that he was a hermit who had given up on everything. But the letter was clear. Jacob wanted to meet him. Caleb tucked the envelope into the pocket of his jacket, looking up at the darkening sky above. He didn't know why Jacob Morris, of all people, was interested in him, but something inside him said that accepting that invitation could change everything. As Caleb clutched the letter, he couldn't imagine the impact that meeting would have on his life. Across town, Jacob watched the sealed envelope with an expression that blended urgency and hope. What did Jacob know about Caleb? And why was he so sure that the two were connected in ways Caleb had yet to comprehend? The answer was closer than Caleb imagined, and far more surprising. Caleb adjusted the collar of his jacket as he gazed at Jacob Morris's property. The house was imposing, with a facade of worn stone and huge windows that seemed to watch over the entrance with an air of sternness. He wasn't sure what to expect from this meeting. The letter was still in his pocket, a silent reminder that something greater was at stake. His walk to the door was slow, his footsteps echoing on the gravel path. Caleb hesitated before knocking on the aged wood, but the door swung open before he could decide. Jacob in the flesh was exactly as Caleb had imagined, tall, slender, with a face etched by deep wrinkles and eyes that seemed to see beyond the obvious. He wore a wool sweater and held a cane in one hand while the other kept the door ajar. "You came?" Jacob's voice was deep yet not intimidating. "Your letter seemed important." Caleb tried to sound confident, but there was a hint of nervousness in his voice. Jacob gestured for him to enter. "Come in, I don't like conversations in the wind." The interior of the house was a stark contrast to its external appearance. Although everything was clean and organized, there was a chill that seemed to seep into each room. The walls were adorned with old portraits and dark wooden furniture. A large pendulum clock dominated the room, its ticking echoing in the silence. "Sit down, Caleb." Jacob pointed to an armchair next to an unlit fireplace. Caleb complied, sitting carefully. Jacob settled into a nearby leather chair, resting his cane beside him. "Do you know why I asked you to come?" "I have no idea," Caleb admitted honestly. Jacob gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "I've been watching you over the past months, but especially in the last few weeks. You stand out, Caleb, not because you're stronger or more skilled, but because you have something that's almost vanished from this town. Decency." Caleb didn't know how to respond. Jacob continued, not allowing for interruptions. "I've seen enough in my life to know that people like you are rare, and Millfield needs rarities now more than ever." Caleb furrowed his brow. "I don't understand. What does this have to do with me?" Jacob rose with some effort, walking over to a bookshelf. He picked up an old photo album and returned to his chair. Opening it, he showed Caleb a black and white photo of a young man next to a woman with a radiant smile. "This was me many years ago, and this is my wife, Evelyn." Caleb looked at the photo. Jacob seemed almost unrecognizable, standing tall with an expression of happiness that contrasted sharply with his current appearance. "She was the best of me," Jacob continued, his voice softening. "Evelyn and I built a lot together. We invested in land, in stocks. We made more money than we could ever spend. But losing her destroyed something inside me." Jacob closed the album with a firm motion. "After she died, I lost faith in people. I came to believe that everyone only wanted what I could offer financially. I isolated myself. I hoarded everything, thinking I was protecting what we had built. But I realized now that was a mistake." Caleb leaned forward, trying to absorb what Jacob was saying. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because in watching you, I noticed something." Jacob looked directly into Caleb's eyes. "You are exactly the kind of person Evelyn believed could change the world. Someone who does the right thing even when there's no reward." Caleb fell silent, trying to process what he was hearing. Jacob leaned in, resting his hands on his cane. "I want to fund a project, Caleb, something that transforms Millfield. I want to see this town thrive again, but I need someone to lead it, and I want that to be you." The silence that followed was almost deafening. Caleb opened his mouth but couldn't form words. Finally, he shook his head. "Me? No, I can't do this. I'm not a leader, Jacob. I just try to survive." "Exactly." Jacob's response was quick. "You know what it means to fight. You know what it means to lose and keep trying. That's what this town needs." Caleb stood up, beginning to pace the room. "This doesn't make sense. There are better people for this. People who know how to deal with money, with projects. I don't know anything about that." Jacob watched Caleb for a moment before speaking, his voice gentler this time. "Do you think I knew how to build what I built? I made more mistakes than you can imagine, but the secret isn't in knowing everything. It's in learning. It's in not giving up." He paused before adding, "Besides, Caleb, I'm not asking for perfection. I'm asking for courage." Caleb looked at Jacob, trying to find a way out of the conversation, but the determination in the man's eyes was unwavering. "And what if I fail?" Caleb asked, his voice barely a whisper. Jacob smiled slightly. "Then you learn and try again. Failure is only final for those who give up." The simplicity of the answer struck Caleb like a blow. He sat back down, feeling the weight of the decision before him. He knew Jacob was right in many ways, but that didn't make the idea any less daunting. "And what exactly do you have in mind?" he finally asked. Jacob straightened up, satisfied with the question. "We start small. We restore degraded areas, create opportunities for people to get involved. The focus will be on the community. We'll give Millfield a reason to believe again." As Jacob explained the details, Caleb realized that although the plan was ambitious, it wasn't impossible. But what impressed him most was Jacob's passion, something he hadn't expected from a man who seemed so reclusive and distant. When the conversation ended, Jacob handed Caleb an envelope. "Here's the first step. I want you to use this to get started. Think of it as a test." Caleb opened the envelope and saw a check for a considerable amount. He swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the responsibility being placed on his shoulders. "I'll think about it," he said, standing up. Jacob nodded, but his expression suggested he already knew Caleb's answer. "Take as much time as you need, but don't take too long. Millfield is waiting." As Caleb stepped out of the house, he felt the cold air against his face. He glanced at the check again, as if he needed to convince himself it was real. The idea of leading something so grand felt absurd, but at the same time, there was a part of him that wanted to try. Perhaps, just perhaps, he could make a difference. As Caleb walked back home, clutching the check with trembling hands, he had no idea that his decision would trigger a series of events that would change Millfield forever. However, it wouldn't be easy. Forces, both within and outside the town, were ready to challenge every step he took. And soon Caleb would discover that Jacob's past was not as simple as it seemed. The cold in Millfield felt less intense that morning, or maybe it was just Caleb's determination that made him ignore the chill. He looked at the paper in his hands, a rudimentary sketch of what could be a transformation map for the town. The lines were uneven, the notes hastily scribbled, but to him, it was more than just a plan. It was the first real attempt to change something, to prove to Jacob, and to himself, that he could make a difference. As he walked through the streets, Caleb noticed the stares. Some residents watched him with skepticism, while others looked on with curiosity. He knew that his decision to lead the project wouldn't be accepted right away. Millfield was a town that had lost faith, not only in itself but in any promise of change. In the town square where the snow was beginning to melt, Amelia was already waiting for him. She held a clipboard and wore a blue scarf that contrasted with the city's dull grey. Emily stood beside her, holding a bucket that seemed too large for her. "So are you ready to get started?" Amelia asked, smiling but with a worried look. Caleb took a deep breath. The first community meeting was held in the old Millfield Library. The building, once grand, now had cracks in the walls and cobwebs in the corners. About 20 people showed up, some sitting in broken chairs, others leaning against the walls. Winston, of course, was there, sitting in the front row with his arms crossed and a cynical smile. Caleb started slowly explaining the plans. He talked about restoring abandoned areas, creating community spaces, and finding ways to revitalize local small businesses. With every sentence, he felt the assessing gazes of the audience, especially from Winston. When Caleb finished, an uncomfortable silence hung in the air. It was Winston who broke it. "And who's going to pay for all this?" he asked, his voice dripping with irony. "Or have you already secured a check from your friend Jacob?" Caleb felt a flush rise to his face but kept his composure. "Jacob is helping, yes, but this isn't about money. It's about collective effort. If everyone contributes, we can start small changes that will grow over time." Winston laughed, shaking his head. "Collective effort. This town can hardly drag itself to work every day. Do you really think you can lead something like this? Before Caleb could respond, Amelia stood up. Maybe the question isn't whether Caleb can lead, but whether we have the courage to follow him. The statement echoed through the room, provoking murmurs among those present. Winston narrowed his eyes, clearly displeased with Amelia's intervention. In the following days, Caleb began to work on the first actions. He and a small group of volunteers, including Amelia and Emily, started cleaning up an abandoned park on the north side of town. It was a small space, but with potential. The neighborhood kids watched curiously, and soon a few of them joined in, grabbing trash bags and sweeping up dry leaves. "Are you hiring helpers?" asked a red-haired girl holding a broom larger than she was. Caleb smiled. "We always need more heroes." The presence of the children gave the group renewed energy. Caleb watched as they cleaned with enthusiasm, playing and laughing. He realized something. The change wasn't just physical. A spirit of hope was beginning to emerge. As work on the park progressed, Winston continued his attacks. He used his influence to spread rumors that Caleb was wasting Jacob's money and that the project was nothing but an empty spectacle. Some residents began to question Caleb's intentions, while others remained indifferent. One afternoon, while Caleb was picking up debris, Winston showed up accompanied by two men who usually worked for him. "How's the show going?" Winston asked, crossing his arms. Caleb wiped his hands clean and turned to him. "We're making progress despite the distractions." Winston let out a short laugh. "Progressing? Do you really think sweeping streets and planting a few flowers is going to save this town?" Before Caleb could reply, Amelia intervened, stepping forward with firmness. "It's a start, and sometimes all we need is a start." Winston stared at her for a moment but didn't respond. He simply shook his head as if he were dealing with foolish children and walked away. That night, Caleb sat in the trailer, exhausted. He held a notebook where he jotted down notes about the next steps. Although the day had been productive, he felt the weight of the criticism and expectations. He knew that for many, he was still a nobody trying to do something impossible. There was a knock at the door. It was Amelia, with Emily beside her. "Are you okay?" she asked, entering without waiting for an invitation. Caleb smiled despite his fatigue. "I'm fine, just thinking about what comes next." Amelia placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're doing more than anyone expected. That's already something big." Emily, who had been silent until then, handed Caleb another drawing. This time it was a picture of the park, with green trees and children playing. "This is how it will look when you're done," she said with conviction. Caleb looked at the drawing and felt a lump in his throat. "Thank you, Emily. I'll do my best to make it happen." Days turned into weeks, and signs of change began to appear. The park was nearly finished, and other residents started to join the group. A local bakery donated bread for the volunteers, and a hardware store lent tools. Slowly, the initial resistance gave way to a sense of community that had long been lost. But not everything was easy. One night, Caleb found the flower beds they had planted destroyed. Someone had deliberately ripped them out. He felt a mix of anger and frustration, but Amelia was there to remind him that setbacks were inevitable. "The important thing is that we keep going," she said. Caleb nodded, determined. He knew he couldn't stop now. As Caleb watched the park begin to take shape, he had no idea that the challenges were just starting. Hidden forces in Millfield were beginning to stir, and even those who seemed like allies might not be what they appeared. But the question Caleb kept asking himself was, would he be ready to face what was coming next? Quick pause. If this story is touching your heart, please subscribe to the channel, give this video a thumbs up, and leave a comment with your thoughts. Your support is vital for the growth of our channel and motivates us to keep sharing these powerful narratives. Let's pick up where we left off. The morning fog wrapped Millfield like a heavy blanket, blurring the outlines of the streets and making the town almost unrecognizable. Caleb was in the small makeshift office at the community park, checking the remaining supplies. The list seemed to shrink with each passing day, but he knew that with patience and creativity, he could make things work. Then the news came. Brian, one of the young volunteers, burst in, clutching a broken piece of wood. "Caleb, we have a problem." His breathing was ragged. "What happened?" Caleb asked, immediately standing up. Brian led him to one of the storage areas where construction materials were kept. Bags of cement had been ripped open, the sand mixed with mud. PVC pipes were cracked, as if someone had deliberately stepped on them. Caleb ran a hand through his hair, feeling anger boil within him. "This wasn't an accident," he murmured. As Caleb inspected the damage, Amelia arrived with Emily. The little girl raced ahead, holding a small bucket as if she were ready to start another day of work. "What happened here?" Amelia asked, surveying the destroyed materials. "Sabotage," Caleb replied, gritting his teeth. "Someone did this on purpose." Amelia placed a hand on Caleb's shoulder. "Who would do something like this?" Before he could answer, Caleb noticed something in the corner of the shed, footprints in the mud leading outside. He followed the trail, which abruptly ended near the fence surrounding the property. Whoever had done this knew how to escape without being seen. Later, as Caleb tried to reorganize what could be salvaged, a rumor began circulating among the volunteers. Someone mentioned seeing one of their own helpers, Derek, leaving the shed the night before. Derek was a man in his early 30s, always quiet but hard-working. He had joined the project a few weeks ago, saying he needed something to occupy his time. Caleb found Derek near the playground, carrying a stack of boards. As he approached, he saw the man avoid his gaze. This only confirmed his suspicions. "Derek, I need to talk to you," Caleb said, crossing his arms. The man stopped, holding the boards as if they were a shield. "What is it?" "Were you in the shed last night?" Caleb asked directly. Derek hesitated, but finally sighed and lowered his head. "Yes, it was me." The confession hit Caleb like a punch to the stomach. He stepped back, trying to control his anger. Why would you do this?" Derek dropped the boards to the ground, running his hands over his face. "I didn't want to, Caleb, but Winston paid me to do it. I needed the money. My wife is sick and the medical bills are crushing us. He knew that and used it against me." Caleb felt a whirlwind of emotions. He wanted to scream at Derek, wanted to kick him off the project. But looking at the man in front of him, he saw something beyond betrayal. He saw desperation. Derek wasn't the true enemy. "Why didn't you come to me?" Caleb asked, his voice more controlled. "Because I knew you couldn't help me the way Winston could," Derek replied, tears welling in his eyes. The silence between them was heavy until a child's voice broke it. "Are you mad at him, Caleb?" Emily was there, holding the drawing she had made the previous week. Caleb looked at the girl and then back at Derek. "I am, Emily, but sometimes people do wrong things because they're scared." Emily tilted her head, thoughtful. "And when I do something wrong, Mommy always gives me another chance. Maybe he just needs a second chance, too." The simplicity of Emily's response struck Caleb like lightning. He turned to Derek, who looked shriveled in shame. "All right," Caleb finally said. "I will give you that second chance, but you need to promise me you'll never do something like this again, and if Winston tries to use you again, you come to me. Understood?" Derek nodded quickly, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you, Caleb. I swear I will do everything right this time." In the following days, Derek worked harder than any other volunteer. He not only helped fix the damage he had caused, but also brought new ideas to improve the project. Gradually, other volunteers began to accept him again, and Caleb felt he had gained a valuable ally. But Winston was not pleased. He watched from a distance, seeing the community grow stronger around Caleb, even after his attempt at sabotage. For the first time, he began to question his own actions, not because he felt guilty, but because he started to realize that Caleb was more resilient than he had expected. One night, while Caleb reviewed the project accounts at his makeshift desk, Amelia appeared. She brought a bottle of hot tea and 2 mugs. "You've been working too hard," she said, pouring the tea. Caleb laughed. "So I guess I have no choice. I heard about what happened with Derek." Amelia watched him carefully. "It was a tough decision." Caleb nodded. "It was, but I don't want to lead this with anger or revenge. If we're trying to build something, we need to start with compassion." Amelia smiled. "Sounds like Emily influenced you." Caleb looked at his tea mug, thinking about the child who always saw the good in people. "So I think she has a way of simplifying things." By the weekend, the park was finally ready. Children ran to play on the new swings and slides, while adults admired the freshly planted flower beds. Caleb watched from a distance, feeling a pride he hadn't experienced in a long time. Emily ran up to him, holding his hand. "You did it, Caleb." "No, Emily, we did it," he corrected her, smiling. As the community celebrated, Winston sat alone at home. He stared at an old photograph of Millfield, from a time when the town thrived. Something inside him began to change, but he still didn't know what to do with that feeling. Though the park was a symbol of hope, Caleb knew that the real work was just beginning. Winston had not yet given up, and the fight for Millfield's future was far from over. But Caleb also didn't know that an even deeper secret about Jacob's past was about to come to light, something that would change everything. The sound of rain drummed on the roof of Caleb's trailer as he stared at the phone in silence. The message from Jacob's doctor lingered in his mind. The old man was gravely ill, his condition rapidly deteriorating. Caleb squeezed his eyes shut, trying to push away the feeling of helplessness that overwhelmed him. Jacob had become more than just a benefactor. He was a guide, a constant reminder that strength came from unexpected places. With project funding frozen until Jacob's situation stabilized, Caleb knew he would have to do more with less. But how? The town was already weary, its people exhausted by the broken promises of the past. He felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders like never before. The next morning, Caleb arrived at the community park under a grey sky. Amelia was there as always, supervising the children who ran excitedly across the lawn. Emily was beside her, holding a can of paint. "Caleb!" Emily shouted upon seeing him, running over with her contagious energy. "Look at what we're going to do today." She pointed to one of the abandoned walls next to the park, where several pots of colorful paint were lined up. "We're going to paint murals," she said, smiling as if she had just announced something revolutionary. Caleb raised his eyebrows. "Murals?" Amelia smiled, placing a hand on his shoulder. It was Emily's idea. She said that if we can't fix everything right now, at least we can make it more beautiful. Caleb looked at the girl, who had already begun to draw something on the ground with chalk. He couldn't help but smile. "Sounds like a good idea." As the children worked on the murals, other residents began to show up. First, a mother brought her 2 small children. Then an elderly couple offered to help mix the paints. Soon, a dozen people were involved, each contributing in some way. Caleb watched it all, feeling a spark of hope rekindle. Emily, with her hands covered in blue paint, pulled Caleb over to the main mural. "You have to paint something too?" "I'm not very good at art," he replied, trying to escape. "It doesn't have to be perfect. Just do something that makes you smile," Emily said, handing him a brush. Caleb hesitated, but eventually dipped the brush in the paint and drew a simple tree in the corner of the mural. When he finished, Emily looked at the drawing and smiled. "It's beautiful." Caleb wasn't so sure, but her enthusiasm was enough to make him believe. Meanwhile, Winston watched from a distance inside his car. The scene of the park, filled with residents working together, deeply disturbed him. He knew that Jacob's illness was his chance to destabilize Caleb, but the community's resilience was starting to frustrate his plans. "They still think they can win," Winston muttered to himself, gripping the steering wheel tightly. He knew he needed to act fast. The next day, Winston began to intensify his attacks. He used his influence to spread rumors that Caleb was deceiving the community, making promises he couldn't keep. During a meeting at the community center, he confronted Caleb directly. "Do you really think painting walls is going to save this town?" Winston said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Without money, without resources, all of this is just a facade." Caleb responded calmly but firmly. "It may not be much, Winston, but it's a start. And a start is better than standing still and complaining." The room fell silent, with many residents clearly divided. Amelia, sitting in the front row, began to clap slowly, followed by Emily. Soon others joined in, and Winston stormed out of the room irritated. That night, Caleb visited Jacob in the hospital. The room was small but clean, with fluorescent light casting soft shadows on the walls. Jacob lay in bed, his face pale, but his eyes still sparkled with determination. "You came," Jacob said, his voice weak but filled with conviction. "Of course I came," Caleb replied, sitting beside him. "I needed to tell you that we're moving forward, even without the funding." Jacob smiled, a small but genuine smile. "I knew you would." They sat in silence for a moment until Jacob spoke again. "Caleb, I want you to remember something. It's not money that changes the world, it's the courage to believe. You already have that. The rest will come." Jacob's words hit Caleb deeply. He held the old man's hand, feeling its fragility but also the strength behind his words. "Thank you, Jacob, I won't give up." Jacob closed his eyes, exhausted, but with a smile on his lips. "I know you won't." The next day, Caleb returned to the park with renewed determination. He gathered the volunteers and presented a plan to continue the project using recycled materials and donations. The idea was well received, and more people began to get involved. Emily organized the children to paint more murals, while the adults focused on cleaning the streets and repairing sidewalks. The energy was palpable, and even the skeptics began to notice the difference. As the community worked, Winston isolated himself in his mansion, watching everything unfold from a distance. He felt a mix of anger and envy. Caleb was achieving what he had never been able to do, unite the people, and that bothered him more than he wanted to admit. But Winston was not the type to give up. He began to plan his next move, something that in his mind would be definitive. By the end of the week, the park was unrecognizable. The colorful murals breathed life into the walls, and the surrounding streets were clean and organized. Caleb looked on, feeling a mix of pride and gratitude. He knew there was still much to be done, but this was an important step. Emily ran up to him holding a new drawing. "This is you, Caleb," she said, showing him a colorful portrait of a smiling man next to a tree. Caleb looked at the drawing and then at the girl. "Thank you, Emily. I'll treasure this forever." Amelia approached, smiling. "You're doing a great job." Caleb shook his head. "It's not me, it's them, it's the community." Amelia placed a hand on his shoulder. "And you gave them something they didn't have before, hope." As Caleb celebrated the first successes, he had no idea that Winston was about to play his most risky card yet. And once again, Millfield's fate hung by a thread. Moreover, secrets about Jacob's past were beginning to surface, threatening to shake everything Caleb had built. What would happen when those secrets were revealed? And would Caleb be strong enough to face the storm that was approaching? The day of the community fair dawned sunny, a rare occurrence in Millfield. It felt like a sign that something good was about to happen. The central square had been transformed. Colorful booths were set up, bunting decorated the poles, and the aroma of homemade food filled the air. Children ran around laughing, and adults exchanged warm greetings as they arranged the final details. Caleb was at the center of the excitement, helping to adjust an improvised stage where the main event would take place. He was nervous, although he tried to hide it. The fair wasn't just a chance to raise funds, it was a test of whether Millfield could come together despite adversity. Amelia arrived holding a clipboard, always practical and organized. Emily ran alongside her, carrying a bucket of paint, as if she didn't want to miss the chance to leave her mark on the event. "Is everything going well?" Amelia asked, assessing the stage. "So far, yes," Caleb replied, adjusting the microphone. "I just hope the community sees the value in this." Amelia placed a hand on his shoulder. "They already see it. They just need a push." Caleb tried to smile, but the shadow of Winston loomed over him. He knew the businessman wouldn't stay idle. Winston had spent weeks trying to undermine the project, and Caleb feared what he might do to sabotage the event. By noon, the square was packed. There were booths selling local crafts, games for children, and a small band playing lively tunes. The atmosphere was festive, but Caleb couldn't relax. He scanned the crowd, searching for signs of trouble. And then he appeared. Winston stormed into the square, his immaculate suit standing out against the casual surroundings. He climbed onto the stage uninvited, grabbing the microphone before Caleb could react. The murmur of the crowd turned into tense silence. "People of Millfield," Winston began, his authoritative voice cutting through the air. "We all know this project has been led by Caleb, a man with good intentions but very little experience. He promised change, but what do we have here? Booths and music? Will this save our town?" Some in the crowd exchanged hesitant glances. Caleb stepped onto the stage, but before he could speak, Winston continued. "And let's talk about funding." Jacob Morris, a reclusive man, handed his money to Caleb without any guarantee of return. "And now? The money has stopped, the project is stalled. Do you really want to bet on the impossible?" Caleb felt anger rising, but Amelia, who was at the foot of the stage, made a subtle gesture for him to wait. She was holding something in her hands, a thick envelope. Her eyes were determined. "Enough, Winston," Amelia said, stepping onto the stage beside Caleb. She took the microphone from Winston's hand firmly, her gesture eliciting a collective gasp from the audience. "Everyone here knows how hard we've fought to get this far," she said, her voice strong yet full of emotion. "And they know that every step has been difficult. But what you may not know is that there have been people trying to hinder our progress, people who cannot stand to see Millfield unite." She held up the envelope. "Here are proofs of sabotage. Videos, messages, and testimonies that show who has really been behind the delays and problems in the project." The crowd began to murmur, and Winston stepped back, his face paling. "Winston isn't just trying to discredit Caleb," Amelia continued. "He has sabotaged materials, spread rumors, and paid people to destroy what we are building." The murmurs grew louder, turning into shouts of indignation. Winston attempted to speak, but his voice was drowned out by the protests of the crowd. He quickly stepped down from the stage, his face red with humiliation. Caleb took the microphone, the weight of the moment evident on his shoulders. He looked at the crowd, feeling the tension in the air, but he knew what he needed to say. "I'm not perfect," he began, his voice low but steady. "I've made mistakes, and many times I thought about giving up because it seemed like none of this would make a difference. But every time I thought about stopping, I saw you. I saw children like Emily painting murals. I saw people coming together to clean streets, plant flowers, build something together." He took a deep breath, his voice becoming more emotional. "And this isn't about me. It's not about Winston or Jacob. It's about all of us. It's about Millfield. I believe we can do more, but that's only possible if we do it together. We don't need perfection. We need courage." The square erupted in applause. Amelia smiled beside Caleb, and Emily, in the middle of the crowd, waved excitedly. As the event continued, Winston stood at the entrance of the square, watching everything unfold. He saw children running, people laughing, the stage lit up by an energy he didn't understand. He felt something different, a strange pain in his chest, but not from anger or envy. It was something deeper, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Regret. He slowly walked away from the square, the voices of the community echoing in his ears. He knew he had choices to make, and for the first time he considered the possibility that he might have been wrong. The event was a success, raising enough funds to continue the project for a few more months. But what Caleb valued more than the money was the unity he saw in the community. People who had previously been isolated were now working together, laughing together, believing together. Amelia found Caleb at the end of the day when the square was almost empty. "You were amazing today," she said, handing him a cup of coffee. "It wasn't just me," Caleb replied, looking at the dismantled stage. "It was everyone." "Even so, you are the heart of this whole thing," she said, smiling. Caleb looked at her, feeling something more than gratitude. But he kept that feeling to himself, knowing there was still much work to be done. As Caleb celebrated the victory, he knew the challenges were far from over. Winston wasn't the only obstacle, and Jacob's past held secrets that could change everything. What would happen when those secrets were revealed? And was the Millfield community truly ready to face what was to come? The night was calm after the community event. The lights in the square still shone, but the sounds of laughter and conversation began to fade. Caleb sat on the dismantled stage, gazing at the horizon. Amelia had gone home with Emily, but before leaving she had left a silent promise in her eyes. "We're in this together." Now he was alone with his thoughts, reflecting on the day and Jacob's words echoing in his mind. It's not money that changes the world, but the courage to believe. The next morning, Caleb was awakened by the incessant ringing of his phone. The doctor's voice on the other end was grave but measured. "Caleb, it's about Jacob. He worsened last night. He asked to see you." Without hesitation, Caleb put on his coat and ran to the hospital. Jacob's room was small and quiet, illuminated only by a yellowed lamp in the corner. Jacob lay in bed, his pale skin contrasting with the white sheets. Even weakened, there was something in his eyes still shining with determination. "You came," Jacob whispered, a faint smile appearing on his lips. Caleb sat beside him, holding his hand gently. "So of course I came. What do you need, Jacob?" Jacob pointed to the table beside him, where a sealed envelope rested. Here's the real reason for everything. You'll understand when you open it." Caleb took the envelope, feeling its symbolic weight in his hands. "Jacob, what is this?" "My legacy," Jacob murmured, breathing with difficulty. "Not just for you, but for Millfield and for me." Jacob squeezed Caleb's hand one last time. "Thank you for believing." Those were his last words. Jacob closed his eyes and let out a final sigh, his expression softening into peace. Caleb sat there for a long time, holding his hand, allowing the weight of loss to wash over him. Back at the trailer, Caleb placed the envelope on the table, hesitating before opening it. Finally, he tore the seal and found a series of letters and documents. The first letter was signed by Evelyn, Jacob's late wife. Her words were filled with pain and love. "Jacob, I know you still feel guilt for what happened to David. I do too. But we can't live shackled to the past. If we couldn't bring our own family together, then let's use what we have to bring others together. Create a world where people don't feel what we felt. That will be our redemption." Caleb read each letter with growing emotion. He discovered that Jacob and Evelyn had a son, David, who had disappeared in childhood during a family trip. Despite years of searching, they never found him. Evelyn died with a broken heart, and Jacob, consumed by guilt, isolated himself, accumulating wealth but unable to use it. One of the letters, however, brought an unexpected twist. It was from a detective hired by Jacob years ago, informing him that David might still be alive and living under another name. However, the lead had gone cold before Jacob had a chance to act. Caleb placed the letters on the table, his heart heavy. The community project in Millfield was more than he had imagined. It was Jacob's effort to find peace within himself and honor Evelyn's wish. A few days later, during a community event in Jacob's honor, Caleb took to the stage. The crowd was silent, waiting for his words. He held Evelyn's last letter in his hands. Jacob Morris was more than a benefactor for Millfield. He was proof that kindness can emerge even from the deepest pains. Today I want to share something that few knew. He began to read Evelyn's letter, his voice filled with emotion. The words echoed through the square, touching everyone present. When he finished, many had tears in their eyes. Jacob used his pain to transform lives. He believed that even in the darkest moments, we could find light. And today, I promise you that I will continue his work. Not just for Millfield, but for all those who, like Jacob and Evelyn, carry wounds that need healing. The crowd erupted in applause, but Caleb noticed something in the back of the square. Winston stood there, hands in his pockets, tears streaming down his face. Before Caleb could react, Winston stepped forward. "I want to say something," Winston began, climbing onto the stage. The crowd fell silent. Winston took a deep breath. "I spent a long time trying to destroy what you all built. I was wrong. I was afraid. Jacob showed me something I didn't want to see before. That strength doesn't lie within us alone, but in what we can do together." He looked at Caleb. "Forgive me." Caleb nodded, extending his hand to Winston, who grasped it firmly. The crowd applauded again, this time in unison. 10 years had passed, and the town of Millfield was unrecognizable. The streets were full of life. The murals on the walls glowed with vibrant colors, and the squares were always buzzing with activity. Caleb, now with graying hair, walked through the community park, observing everything with a satisfied smile. Beside him, Amelia held his hand while Emily, now a young woman, organized a group of volunteers. During the annual celebration in honor of Jacob, a middle-aged man appeared in the crowd. He carried an old photograph of Evelyn and approached Caleb. "Sorry to interrupt," his voice was hoarse, "but I think this is my mother." Caleb froze, looking at the man. "Who are you?" "My name is David Morris." Time seemed to stand still. Caleb looked at Amelia and then at Emily before turning back to David. He grasped the man by the shoulders, tears filling his eyes. "Jacob always believed you were alive. He never gave up on you." David smiled, moved. It seems he got what he wanted. The two embraced as the crowd around them cheered. In the center of the town, a plaque shone brightly with Evelyn's words. "When a town comes together, even the deepest pains find healing." And so Jacob's legacy continued, not just in Millfield but in every heart he had touched. The story of Jacob, Caleb, and the revitalization of Millfield reminds us that true transformation begins with compassion, courage, and the willingness to believe in something greater than ourselves. Jacob's legacy, built on love and redemption, teaches us that even the deepest pains can become the foundation for hope and change. Caleb's journey shows the power of unity and how a single act of kindness can ripple into something extraordinary. As the years passed, Millfield flourished, proving that when a community comes together, even the most broken places can be rebuilt and lost connections can be found again. What did you take away from this story? How can acts of kindness and unity create ripples in your own life and community? Share your thoughts below. We'd love to hear what you think. Before you go, subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, give this video a like, and leave a comment sharing your favorite part of the story. Don't forget to watch the next video by clicking the recommended card. It's another story you won't want to miss. Thank you for being part of this journey. See you in the next one.